I just wanted to start, we've talked a lot about this. Fruit systems are really complex systems because they're perennial systems. They're really diverse. They have lots of things in them and outside of them. They're three-dimensional systems. They provide lots of refuge and habitat. And they're really rich food sources. We love fruit. Animals love fruit. Insects and diseases love fruit because they're really nutritious. So they attract all kinds of pests. And so we've talked just a little bit about some pests. We've laid the foundation, the groundwork for all of the good soil, like the literal foundation. And we talked about all the plants and options that we have available. But we haven't really talked about IPM in the literal sense yet. So I wanted to open with that. And what does this group think about IPM? How do you define IPM? Because I know this isn't a new concept for you. So can I get a couple? What is IPM?
It's a way of thinking and a way of doing to approach your garden.
Sure, a way of thinking and doing approaching gardening.
Possibly say cleaner.
Okay, there's a comment about cleaner, or maybe I think you're thinking like lower input maybe, or more pesticide use. It can be a component. What does IPM stand for? Yeah, okay. I think we take it for granted sometimes, this integrated pest management. And so this is a definition that I have sort of distilled from all the conversations that I have had and that I've learned. And how we talk about it often at the IPM program. So it's a science-based approach, first of all, that we're using data to drive our decisions, not just making things up. We're managing pests, so we're not eliminating them. We're incorporating an ecosystem kind of approach and making them at a sustainable level, one that we can tolerate. And then it's sustainably. So we're trying to do something that we can do persistently for a long period of time. And that's not just the environment. We're also thinking about economics. How much does this cost? And human health. So that some of the safety and pesticide use can be part of that. There can be other things that are related to human health as well. And we use a complementary array of many methods. And it's part of this really complex sort of system. So this is a diagram from a recent publication that talks about all the different factors that are being contributed to IPM approaches and how it's impacting production, the sellers, the consumers, and all the communities that are encompassed in that. So it's a really complicated system, and there's not always one right answer. I wanted to back up and give like a little bit of the history of IPM and where this term actually came from. I think this may be a familiar concept as well, but I wanted to point out that we've been using IPM since the beginning of human civilization. The Sumerians were using sulfur compounds to kill pests in growing systems. And so we've always been taking advantage of the natural environment and the resources at our disposal to grow things sustainably. When we talk about integrated pest management, that is a term that I think many people know came about sort of in the 1950s through the 1970s. And that started with increased pest registration, so availability of products to be used, and what led to the Green Revolution, right? They were originally sort of miracle products. We were able to create a lot more food, a lot more efficiently, and feed a lot more people because we could control the pests better. And that's a hard thing to hear now because we know what happened right after that, all of the negative consequences of using pesticides and how it really destroyed ecosystems and how we have to be more careful about how we use them. And so that's where Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came in. And that was sort of the public outcry about what the negative effects of pesticides were and how we needed to be careful about using them. And then immediately as a response to that, the public awareness, the scientific data that was driving that, the EPA was established. The USDA created nationwide funding for IPM programs that led to the development of specific programs for specific pests and specific crops and education of farmers and other people around the country to do IPM. And so we continue that tradition. Uh-oh, what am I doing here?
You're not sharing your slides.
Sorry, thank you for helping. And so we continue that tradition and continue to build on the science and the evidence to do IPM in many ways. And so that has led to more, even at the molecular level, understanding how pesticides are working, how pests are working, and how natural systems are working so that we can integrate more solutions to the problems that we have. We're going. You want me to take care of it? We've advanced a lot of slides. Let's see. No, just click there and then click this one. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I've been juggling a lot of things today. And we've not had too many mess ups. Okay. So when we talk about IPM, I think we often talk about steps of IPM. This guy has become one of my favorite new mascots with all of his PPE and his special equipment. But there are a lot of materials that we use to do IPM effectively in a commercial system and in your home garden. And so IPM begins with correct identification. And I think that probably you know this, but many insects, diseases, and physiological problems present very similarly. And it can be really difficult to figure out which one you have. And if you don't know which one you have, you'll go about management in completely different ways, and you could be totally incorrect. So I often get calls about yellow leaves on my apple tree. How many things do you think cause yellow leaves on your apple tree? No pictures. And then I often get blurry pictures of yellow apple trees. And so it's really important to figure out when were those apple leaves turning yellow? What is the pattern of the yellowing on the apple leaves? Are there any fruiting bodies from a fungus or something that's growing? Are they falling off the tree? Are the fruits sticking on? Are there any other like brown lesions or things like that? What do the roots look like? And so looking really carefully and identifying properly will help you manage effectively. Then you learn the biology of the pest that you're working with so that you can effectively interfere with that life cycle and disrupt it to remove it from the system if it's a pest. Also, we're sampling for pests. So we know when certain things are active during the year, and I have another slide coming up, but we are looking for them. We're out in the garden, we're looking for them on the plants, we're looking for them in traps so that we know when they're active, so we can interfere with the life cycle at the appropriate time. We know if we even have a population out there because we've been looking for it. Then you determine an action threshold. So you determine what level can you tolerate before it becomes too much and you don't have any fruit for yourself, or your fruit is not economically or financially sustainable. And so you determine what that threshold is. In commercial systems, obviously, that's much lower than in home gardens. So we don't tolerate very much damage at all in apple production systems. Then you choose the appropriate tactic. And so I'm going to go through a bunch of tactics. And finally, we get to evaluation. What good does it do if you don't go back and look at how well it worked? Should you do it again next year? Did it not work at all and you should never do it again? So it's really important to evaluate. I wanted to show this really briefly. This is a little technical, but this is just illustrating the point of threshold. So without any intervention, your pest population would follow this red line. It'll just keep on going. But at some point it will surpass your economic injury level. So that's where it's not sustainable. It's causing too much damage and that you can't tolerate. And in a commercial system, you'll lose something. But if you take some kind of action at the action threshold, you'll curb that population before it becomes economically damaging. So we try to figure out where that threshold is. So that's all, a little bit technical, simple concept. This is what I was talking about with apple stages, so growth stages. We start talking about dormant before the buds break, then we move into green tip is when the first green tissue is showing. Half-inch green, tag clusters when you first see the flower clusters, into pink right before bloom, bloom, petal fall when all the petals are falling off the tree, then the fruit starts sizing and then you approach harvest. And so this is really critical for apple as well as other fruit crops because different pests are active at different times during this phenological progression. So the trees are really sensitive to temperature and moisture during the growing season. Insects and diseases are also really sensitive to temperature and moisture and the growing conditions. And so they're kind of evolved together to progress along the same line. And so we know at a certain time of the year, when the trees are at this stage, that certain pests are going to be active too. So this year, where it's a couple of weeks early across the entire state in the Northeast, the trees are a little bit early, we could see that. And we also know, okay, the insects are probably out a couple of weeks early too. So we know to be looking for them a little bit earlier. So instead of using a calendar approach to managing pests, we use this sort of phenological calendar to sort of predict when many pests are active. And so this is a link of many different fruit trees and their phenological progression. Okay, moving into some tactics. I told you I was going to talk mostly about tactics. I like to think of them in the form of a pyramid. Has anyone ever seen this kind of diagram before? One or two hands, yeah. Okay, so at the foundation of our pyramid are these cultural controls. This is the genetic control. So plants that are already resistant to your pests. So if you know you have a certain problem, why not plant a pest that's sort of immune to it or has some resistance? It will save you so much time in the long run. There are also regulatory, like so quarantines fit in this category. So trying to keep it from ever being present in the first place, some of these. Next up is mechanical. So these are sort of physical interventions, things like a fence. We've talked a lot about fences for deer today. Using mulches, so physical barriers and exclusion. Cultivation, so I'll talk a little bit about cultivation, and I know we just heard that that can be bad. Too much cultivation too deep for soils can be problematic, but it can also be really beneficial for managing some pests. Biological is sort of the next level up from that, and so that includes natural enemies, parasitoids, predators, microbial things that will intervene in your ecosystem that can help manage some pests. And then finally, at the top, I include chemical control because it's a really valuable tool in the toolbox in many systems if it's applied in an appropriate way or in targeted ways. And I like to include it because there's a range of chemicals. A lot of them are really terrible, and we are trying to get people to stop using them. But there are many newer pesticides that are a little bit more benign, and they are more biologically based, where they're very targeted, specific compounds that have very minimal effect on human health. So there is a whole lot of chemicals out there that can potentially be integrated in a system, but it has to be done in a smart way, in a way that makes sense. And I think about it more like a tool in the toolbox that you could pick up once in a while. If you need to tighten a screw, you get that screwdriver out. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of each of the types of tactics that we talked about. And so cultural controls, again, we think of as changes to the production system. We've already talked a little bit about site selection. So thinking about soils, thinking about access to water and good soil drainage, and also air drainage. Laura showed a similar picture to this. So making sure that you're thinking about frost pockets in the appropriate place on your site for good air drainage. Also thinking about air drainage helps with disease. And so if you have good airflow through your site, you know you're not going to have as much humidity and build up in that way. And so you can help dry out the leaves more quickly and prevent the buildup of disease. I mentioned some varieties and also rootstocks that are resistant to pests. And so there are tons and tons of awesome varieties that we don't often hear the names of that are resistant to things like apple scab, to powdery mildew, to rusts, and to fire blight, which are some of the big diseases of apples. And that's true for apples, that's true for a lot of different tree fruit and small fruit. And so just looking through the nursery catalogs and picking things that say disease resistant can take you a long way. And then the rootstocks, I think most people in this group understand most of our commercial tree fruit are grafted. So there's a top part of the tree that we call the scion, and there's a bottom part called the rootstock. And the rootstock confers mostly size control. So it takes us from having a big old standard size tree to a really dwarfed tree, which can be easier to manage and you can grow more in a smaller space. It also can confer cold hardiness. And so a healthy tree is a happy tree, is less susceptible to pests. And it can confer pest resistance. So we have a pest right now, woolly apple aphid, that is really, really challenging for commercial apple growers to manage. And we have rootstocks that they can purchase that are more resistant to woolly apple aphid. And so if they do that, they have less of a hard time controlling it. Okay, moving into some mechanical control. So as we've already talked about deer fence, canopy management, good sanitation. Okay, so good sanitation, this is where I wanted to mention like mowing. We've talked about leaving your leaves in place for organic matter, but also a lot of disease overwinters on leaf litter. And so in apple systems, one of the things that we do is try to accelerate decomposition by mowing or applying nitrogen to the ground, so decomposition will happen faster. And that removes the source of inoculum for things like apple scab. So that's something that you can do in a system like this. Biological controls, Amara is going to be with us in the afternoon and talk a little bit more about this and natural enemies. But these are introducing or helping maintain populations of living organisms or their products in the system. And so these can be vertebrates or invertebrates, or they can be microorganisms. Two of my favorite that are in apple systems, I just mentioned woolly apple aphid. And so this is an aphid, but it produces a solid excrement. So we think of honeydew as usually the byproduct of aphids. This aphid produces wool, hence woolly apple aphid, so it's a solid sort of honeydew. So they get covered and protected from things around them. And this pest has a little parasitoid that's, both of them are native to the North America. And so where we find woolly apple aphid, we often find these mummies with circular holes in them where the parasitoid has gone in and laid its egg and then emerged. And so this happens all the time. Mites are another one where we have two kinds that really affect apple orchards. So two-spotted spider mite and European red mite. And they're prevalent like the past couple of weeks when we've had really hot, dry conditions, really dusty. Mite populations can surge really quickly. And there are many out there. There are also many predator mites. And so you can encourage or you can introduce more predator mites to help manage these pest mite populations. Okay, and I just wanted to give a couple of suggestions about if you're going to use pesticides, how to do it smartly, because there are a time and a place in some systems to use pesticides, and it's important to be doing it responsibly. And so making informed application, making sure to choose materials that are really specific to the application that you want to make, to the pest, to the site, and to the time of year that you want to be managing something. And you need to read the label. It will have all of that spelled out on it and give you clear instructions for what you are allowed legally to apply it for. You can use selective pesticides as opposed to broad spectrum pesticides, which will be targeting a very specific pest and less likely to impact non-target pests. So you can still maintain that resilient ecosystem and hopefully only affect the pests that you're after. Like I said, using thresholds to determine when they're appropriate. Making sure you're calibrated appropriately. So if you are applying, making sure you're applying the right amount so it will be effective and it will not be too much. And then using safe handling and application procedures. So that's all on the label too. PPE is personal protective equipment. And so that is in the label as well. There's really thorough instructions if you're going to use a product to know how to use it responsibly. Also practicing good resistance management. So if you find something that works, it's tempting to just keep using it over and over again because it works. But we know that if you keep using something a lot, nature is going to find a way to get around it. We're going to evolve resistance. And so it's really important if you're using any kind of pesticide to use different groups. So Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, they label the pesticides based on their mode of action, the way that they work, with a number. And so choosing a different number or different EFRAC group for your different applications within a season can help alleviate the potential development of resistance in the pest population. And like I said, the label is the law. All the information comes with the pesticides, so making sure to follow along with that. Okay, we're right up getting close to time, so I just wanted to give you a couple of pictures of things that we see in apple orchards, but I'm going to give you a lot more examples out in the orchard later this afternoon. So we're going to go through this quick. These are common internal worms. So when you get a worm in your fruit, these are probably the guys that you're looking at. So this is codling moth. This drives most pest management programs in most apple trees that I see. Oblique banded leaf roller is another similar moth, and oriental fruit moth is also an internal feeder. Actually, oblique banded leaf roller feeds on the outside usually, but it's a little bit different. But we call this the Lepidopteran complex. So we're usually managing these in apple systems. And so I just wanted to show this complex chart to show you that there are lots of different pests. And then there are the phenological stages. And all of the science that's been done at Cornell and other universities, and on farms, we've determined approximately when these guys are active throughout the growing season. And these are just a handful of the pests that we're looking at on an annual basis in apple orchards. But because we know when they're active with each phenological stage, we can predict their activity and manage them at those corresponding times. And so what we're usually doing is we're hanging traps. These have on commercial farms. So I'm going to give you a little bit more precision, probably not something you'll do in your home garden. But what we do at the commercial level is we hang these traps with pheromone lures. So they are the sex pheromones that males or females are using to find each other. And so we catch the male in the traps because they're looking for a female to mate with. And then we know when they're active. And because we know when they're active, we know when they're flying and about when they're going to lay eggs. And then we know about when they're going to hatch. And those young larvae are the ones that are most susceptible to management. So if that's a BT that you're using or something else that you're using, or if you're just going to pick them off, you know approximately when you're going to be looking for them. And so we can continue to monitor weekly using that initial trap capture, the biofix, to predict their activity. And that's sort of the premise for managing insects in an orchard is you keep track of when they're active and then manage them at the specific time when they're most susceptible. I'm going to skip through this a little bit and get to apple scab because this is the main disease that we often manage in apple orchards, and it's a good example that's been studied a lot. So this is a fungal pathogen, and this is one of the ones that I was talking about. It overwinters on the orchard floor, on leaf litter and leaf debris. And so if you clean up all your leaf debris, you don't have any inoculum left. So no pesticides needed. And you can do that by either mowing. I have a couple growers that I work with that are organic, and they actually vacuum all of their leaves off of their grass lawn underneath their trees. It's intensive, but you can do it. And so if there are any leaves left, what this pathogen does is it releases spores in the spring that infect the newest green tissue. So we know that the early green tissue really needs to be protected. So making sure to put a fungicide on if you're going to do that early in the spring to protect the newest, earliest, most susceptible green leaves is the time to be doing that. And then you know you don't have to be doing it for the rest of the season. But other things that you can do, like I've been talking about resistant varieties. There are so many scab resistant varieties that are so delicious and fun to grow. It makes me a little bit sad when I see home gardeners put in trees like Gala and Fuji. Like, why would you can go to the store and buy this? Why not buy something more interesting that is going to be easier to grow in your home garden? Other things that you can do, so I sort of talked again about the phenological stages, and during dormant, you can be pruning to improve drying time, and you can be removing that leaf litter to remove inoculum. And then if you are going to put a fungicide on, like I said, you do that early in the growing season, protect that newest leaf tissue, targeting when the pathogen is most active and active.